Welcome, everybody. My name is Joel Brennan. I don't know if you have an agenda. The agenda might have said that it was Greg Marcus that was going to lead you off, because it's usual that the chair of the board does this. But Greg let me know late last night that he was called away, couldn't be here today. So in addition to making some remarks, I'll also be kind of your master of ceremonies today. So I'm wearing a couple of hats for you. And I want to, before we start, I want to welcome everybody. Again, this is the second in-person meeting we've had here at the University Club in the last few months. We also did a third membership meeting that was a mayoral debate that was held at the ICC, and that a number of you may have been at. And it is really great to be back in person at these events. I'm starting to see people who I've seen and been with out in the community over the last couple of months during my tenure here, and it's nice to be able to gather together as well. I want to note just a couple of our special guests, one of whom I'll talk about a little bit later. But last Tuesday was a historic day in the city of Milwaukee, and officially today we get to welcome Mayor Cavalier Johnson here. And we also have, I think, a couple of newer returning members, one of whom you're going to hear more from today. Austin Ramirez, his back is to me, but Austin is a returning member to the Greater Milwaukee Committee. And then Bill Robinson from Engberg Anderson Architects, also a new member. Our membership and nominating committee met last week, at the end of last week. And in the coming months, we had a really great discussion. In the coming months, you're going to see some additional new members and membership from that. And, I would just also say, while I noted a couple of special guests, you are all special guests because we have had so long to not be here together. I also want to note that this is the first time, I think in virtually the last 2 years, that we will not have a COVID-19 update by Dr. John Raymond. That was at his request because of where we are in the public health space right now. But we still, however, get reminders that we are not fully with COVID-19 in the rearview mirror. I think a lot of us are familiar the multitude of cases that came out of the gridiron dinner that happened in Washington, D.C. within the last few weeks. And one of our panelists today was, we were going to take this in the direction around cybersecurity. And we found out over the weekend that one of our panelists, a representative from the FBI, is not able to join us because of his own health challenges. And we'll look to do something more specific around cybersecurity. I think that's an issue that's really important in a lot of ways, and the things that are happening on a global nature remind us of the importance of that. We'll touch on it today. We'll do something else for the membership moving forward. But those reminders of COVID continue to be out there. I am 1 day removed from having my second COVID booster shot. And for those of you who don't know how old I am, I could get one, Chevy could not. Okay, let's just say that part. But it is just a reminder for us that we all have individual responsibilities. We all have things we can do in our own neighborhoods, what you're doing as responsible business people when it comes to this front. So we can do as much as we can to totally put that in the rearview mirror. So today, we're going to start with some decidedly local matters, with a little bit of conversation with our newly elected mayor, pivot to actions and things around the globe, but also come back to the impact that has on our local community, and what that means here for each of our daily lives. Before I get any further, I also want to welcome those of us, or those who are joining us virtually. We've got a room of about 40 or 50 here. It looks like virtually every chair is filled here, which is great, but there are other people who are joining us online, which is also terrific. And we're doing that thanks to the services of Magic Productions. We went to Magic just a few weeks ago, and another vendor wasn't able to perform, and they stepped up ably for us. I have a little bit of a connection. I was texting with my sisters today. I have 7 sisters. I'm one of 11 kids, and my sisters, when they were younger, demonstrably younger, they babysat Mike Jerkin, who's the head of Magic Productions. And so I had a little bit of an in there. But I also, I just want to note that Magic is through Mike and through his wife, Monica, through David Caruso. In my prior role at the Department of Administration, they worked with me and they worked with the state to get resources into the hands of organizations like Magic, but also vendors, caterers, light and sound producers, event planners, all of whom's business kind of dried up during COVID-19. And they were on the front end of this. They were going to survive no matter what, but they know that there were colleagues of theirs that wouldn't necessarily without some additional help. So we put together a program that they really helped to orchestrate during COVID-19. To ensure that ice sculptors and other small businesses, florists, were not going to go out of business due to the fact that that we couldn't gather and do stuff. So I appreciate what Magic does for us and what they're able to do for us today. I also appreciate what they do in the community. I've spent the last couple of months meeting with many of you, whether in small groups or at the location of your businesses, and I'm really pleased and I'm proud of the work that's going on in the community, the energy that's around where we're going. In the next several weeks, we're going to be outlining a strategic planning process that we'll be doing at the GMC. Many of you who have been part of the conversations heretofore will be part of that, so I thank you in advance. Well, I think what we all want as we think about the direction of where we're going is to be an organization that's like many of the people and many of the organizations that are represented here. We want to be passionate. We want to be strategic. We want to work on the most important pressing issues of the day. And we want to make sure we're doing that together. I will tell you, after a couple of months of work, and virtually all my colleagues at the Greater Milwaukee Committee, or a number of them, are here intermingled with the membership today. There's great work being done, but I can tell you candidly, I'm not sure that all of you know enough about it. I'm not sure that the community knows enough about it. And so as we go into what our strategic planning looks like and where we're going, we'll assess the effectiveness of that, but we'll also try to communicate more with you about those, the most important issues that we have to deal with. And I would just tell you that after a couple of months of being out there and having community conversations, the issues that continue to come to the fore are not going to be ones that are of a huge surprise to anybody here. Crime, K-12 education, early childhood education, housing, workforce development, the need for more people to be actively engaged and involved in the workforce. All of those are ones on which the community has dialogue around and wants the GMC to be working on as well. And so again, we will continue those conversations as time moves forward and look forward to working with you on those. I want to give you just a couple of updates on what's going on at the Greater Milwaukee Committee before introducing our first speaker. Today is a banner day for us, but it's also a banner day for one of our former colleagues. Today marks Elmer Moore's first day as the CEO and Executive Director of WEDA, the Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority. He was appointed by the governor to that position maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. And as I recall, that pivot happens, and I can tell you that pivot happens very quickly. So Elmer spent a couple of weeks making sure that he could wrap up and we wouldn't miss a beat with the work that we're doing at Scale Up, but he also was getting ready to jump in with both feet. And we look forward to working with him on the issues that we're doing around MKE United, the Community Development Alliance, and other partners around housing issues. It'd be important for Milwaukee, good for Milwaukee that he's there, but also we really appreciate and extend our congratulations to him for his new role. Just prior to his departure, Scale Up launched the 7th cohort of Spark, which is an accelerator program for small businesses, especially in the Hispanic and African American communities. There are 21 small businesses that are part of this. I think 16 are women-owned. They expect significant growth in the coming year. And this is a program that has been ongoing for several years at the Greater Milwaukee Committee and is having a deep impact in the community. This summer, with the staff, the continued staff and the support at Scale Up, there'll be an 8th growth accelerator for somewhat larger businesses that'll launch during the summer. 10 to 15 larger businesses will be part of that cohort. So the work continues at Scale Up, and there'll be conversations with the supporters and the members of the community who have been deeply involved in Scale Up. I also wanted to note that while we had Elmer depart, we also welcome a new employee who Elmer hired in his waning days at Scale Up, Jared Lee, who's our new content and marketing manager. And Jared, why don't you just wave so everybody knows who you are? You can give him a round of applause even to make him feel welcome. Next, the Hone Group and GMC are hosting another cohort of our Forward 48, the region's premier leadership development program for young professionals. We create in-person virtual leadership seminars by Milwaukee civic leaders, a number of whom are in the room here, a number of our faculty who are here and who are in other major positions. This is just a program that is terrific for the overall community. That program we will launch at the end of April. If you have new applicants or potential applicants for that, please make sure that you connect with Heather on that or Maggie, both of whom are here. It equips, the Forward 48 equips participants with interaction and instruction from Milwaukee's top business and community leaders, advanced leadership skills, toolkits, and they also, the participants receive transferable graduate level credits to Marquette University, a complimentary 6-month membership to Rotary Club. So it enables and involves them in the community in ways that I think is important for all of us. Also want to give you an update on the campaign for Julia Taylor's retirement gift. It's a sculpture along the Beer Line Trail, and Julia's not here. I was with her last week. I don't know if this is secret or not, so the members of the press maybe just don't report this. But the sculpture, it's for a sculpture along the Beer Line Trail. So far, we have gathered, members have contributed about $16,000 in gifts. There's still time. Please reach out to Heather at the GMC if you are interested in being part of that. Finally, I'm pleased to announce that the GMC's 2021 annual report is live and on our website. I think you'll all get a link to that in the coming days, but it outlines the work over the last year, the progress made in the focus areas around innovation and talent, economic prosperity, vibrancy of place. So please look for that, provide your feedback with us as we continue to make sure that we're doing things as well as we can. I now have the honor of introducing Mayor Cavalier Johnson, who I'm proud to have called a friend for several years. Mayor Johnson, as I mentioned, made history a year ago, a week ago, made history a year ago too, but a week ago by gaining more than 70% of the vote in the general election. And he'll do it again this week when he raises his arm and takes the oath officially as Milwaukee's 45th mayor and its first elected African-American mayor. Mayor Johnson is from Milwaukee, of Milwaukee. I think all of us learned more about his story during the past several months of the campaign and as he's taken his term here. And he has, by all accounts, hit the ground running since he became mayor. We all know that there are major challenges in a city like Milwaukee, but I believe, and I think lots of people here would agree, there's no one better suited to attack them. No leader addresses those challenges in isolation, and Mayor Johnson will enjoy the GMC's full support in his work. I think it's important for people to note that while Mayor Johnson was elected last week, he is filling out the remainder of the balance of former Mayor Barrett's 4-year term. So it's only 2 years until the next election. I heard him say that he was happy he didn't have to go to a campaign office and do all that. You're going to have to do that pretty soon, sooner than you would like, I think. But it gives us a window into that. Some people may think that the next campaign starts today for the next mayor. And I would tell you, and I think everybody in this room agrees, we can't all be about campaigns. We have to be about action. Cavalier Johnson is a trailblazer in this community. He must be successful, but he has to be successful. And we need to make sure that we're held to account for him being successful. So we'll work hand in hand and hand in glove with him to make sure that he is successful. And on this subject of accountability, I think Cavalier would agree that in its best form, the relationship between an organization like the Greater Milwaukee Committee and the city of Milwaukee is accountable on both parts, where he can be very specific in some of the things that he thinks that the business community, that the membership of this organization can do, that we can make sure that we're providing the right kind of input and support, that we can be transparent, we can be accountable to each other, and we can be working on the most important issues of the day. So I'm really eager to get to work with him. On a personal note, we traveled to Washington just a couple of weeks ago. We were part of the group that was making our last pitch to the Republican National Committee to hold their convention here. And I got the opportunity there to see Mayor Johnson in action, to note that he was strategic, he was direct, he was transparent, he was everything. He took the work that we were doing seriously, but didn't take himself seriously. He wanted nothing more at the end of that day than to get back on that plane, come back here. He was campaigning, he was still doing work, but also he was getting ready for his twin daughter's 4th birthday, which was the next day. And they had a spa day, if I can reveal, where they were getting their nails painted. And so, you know, in addition to all the titles that he has, trailblazer, mayor, up and comer, all the things I think he really appreciates also being a terrific father and somebody who is in this community for his family. And that's really an important thing for us all and a model that we can have. So with that, I just want to welcome officially for the first time to address the Greater Milwaukee Committee, Mayor Cavalier Johnson.
Well, thank you, Joel. That was a great introduction, and I appreciate it. And yeah, I am not somebody who necessarily takes myself seriously. Usually at things like this, when I come and stand at a podium or lectern, as my campaign manager constantly counsels me about, and I let the mic down, I usually tell folks because I'm 5'0". So no, I don't take myself too seriously. And thank you for mentioning, you know, some of the things that we've done, not just on our campaign side. Although, you know, I spent the better part of the last year going to City Hall and then going to my campaign office to do a lot of the work on that end. It was, and it is quite refreshing these days to be able to spend my days at City Hall and to work on the issues that are important to so many people who are residents of this city, who are commuters to this city every day, who are visitors to Milwaukee constantly. So it feels really great to do that. I know there's still some loose ends over the campaign that I've got to work on, such as getting thank you cards out to the many people who contributed to our campaign to make it a success. So if you haven't gotten yours yet, it's coming. So just be on the lookout for that. As was mentioned, I'm Cavalier Johnson. I have the distinction of being the mayor-elect, and on Wednesday will be sworn in as the city's 45th mayor. And it's something that I take great pride in because this is my city. I was born here, I was raised here. I went to Milwaukee Public Schools. My wife and I are raising our children here now after having the opportunity to travel across the country and around the world, participating in service. I decided to come back here to give back to this community because I care about it. And I want Milwaukee to do well. And I know that as we move forward into the future here, in my tenure as mayor, there are a lot of issues that we've been seeking to address over the course of the past few years that still need addressing. And I really want to get to doing that. And I know that the folks in this room will be partners in order to make those things come to fruition. I know that when I was campaigning for the office, even before that, actually as I served as city council president and 2nd district alderman, one of the things that folks told me about, which was a major concern of theirs, was public safety. And public safety twofold. One, because of the senseless numbers of shootings that we see, both fatal as well as non-fatal, and that's acutely more problematic these days because, you know, when COVID set in, we started seeing more and more people who were harmed by gunfire. In 2020, we had a record-breaking year, horrifically. In 2021, that record was broken. And here in 2022, we're on pace to break the record that was set in 2021. Outside of that, when you look at issues of reckless driving on our streets, it's something that folks are concerned about. Literally, no matter where I go in Milwaukee, no matter which neighborhood, no matter how far north, no matter how far south, east, or west, folks are concerned. They're concerned about the people who get behind the wheel of vehicles and deliberately make a choice. They're making a choice to treat that car or that vehicle like a 2,000+ pound missile driving down our streets. And that endangers not only people, but it ruins the quality of life for folks in their neighborhoods. I'm forever stricken by some of the stories that some of my neighbors, folks who live I live just north of Capitol, some folks who live just south of Capitol tell me, and I live over near the Midtown Shopping Center. And the Pick and Save there is my Pick and Save. I go there, I was just there this weekend. And the folks who live on the south side of Capitol, they would tell me that they don't go to that Pick and Save. They choose a different grocery store farther away from where they live. And why is because we have this issue of reckless driving, and they don't want to be in a position where they are crossing that street and end up losing their lives. It's even struck my own family. As was mentioned, my daughters just a couple of weeks ago turned 4 years old. They were born in 2018. They're pandemic babies. They haven't really been out, right? And so one of the things that my wife and I did to get them out, to get them some fresh air, to get them outside the house because their life has been on lockdown, was to walk them around the block. And I live just a block away from Marshall High School. And if you watch, some of the news coverage over the last several months, you saw people driving their cars on the school grounds, in a very reckless and dangerous way. So now, my family and others feel uncomfortable, walking our small children around just so they can get a little fresh air. So that's a severe quality of life issue that we actively need to work to address. So I certainly acknowledge that it's a critical issue for anybody that's living in the city of Milwaukee or doing business here in the city of Milwaukee as well. One step I think that we can do to combat those issues that all of us are concerned about is to support the chief. Support Chief Norman as he and his department work to make sure that there are resources available in our community to address the issue of reckless driving. More than a year ago, we launched under Chief Norman's leadership the Traffic Safety Unit, and to date, they've come into contact with and given some education as well as citations to over 20,000 people who are driving recklessly in our city. But that's not enough though either, right? And so on the council side, and certainly in the mayor's office, we've done things as well. In the first tranche of ARPA funds that we received, nearly $197 million, we allocated monies towards the Department of Public Works to help to implement some more immediate solutions right now. And we're complementing that with closing tax incremental financing districts to make sure that we are closing the opportunities for people to drive recklessly. So we're installing curb extensions and bump outs, and we'll be looking at bus bulbs and actual protected bike lanes, not the paint that you see on the street, actual concrete that's poured to protect bicyclists or scooter riders away from the traffic, right? So it's safer not just for them, but it also creates an additional barrier that stops people from being able to drive recklessly in our city. We introduced a plan called Stand for Safer Streets, that encompasses a whole multitude of things. It's safer street design, like I just discussed, but it's also making sure that there's traffic enforcement that's there, because that's completely necessary in this. It is absolutely necessary in this, that when people are driving recklessly, that they're caught, and we have the police resources to do that. Speaking of having them captured, that's just one part of the equation. They also need to be held to account. And so I've stood up and I've said, look, if somebody's causing death, harm, or destruction with a gun or with a car or any other way in our community, then they should be held accountable for those actions. One of the other things, a part of that plan, is engaging the neighbors. Those same neighbors I was just talking about, those folks who feel like they can't cross the street in their own neighborhood, bringing their voice into the conversation so that they can help to come up with the solutions necessary to stem the tide of reckless driving that we see in our neighborhoods. And then lastly, demanding progress, because a number of the streets, the corridors where we see the most egregious reckless driving behavior. Think about Capitol Drive, for instance. That is State Highway 190. It's technically a state highway that has jurisdiction here in the city of Milwaukee. So we don't, at the local level, have complete jurisdiction over that. We have to work with our partners at the state. And so we need to demand progress from them, because the way that those roads function in the city of Milwaukee is different when they go farther out west into Waukesha County, right? When you go through the city of Milwaukee, you're going through a very dense urban environment with neighborhoods, as well as economic development that's happening too. So we got to make sure that when those roads are going through, that they pay attention to that, and that they understand that there are people whose lives are affected when cars in the city are able to travel just as fast as they can out in wide open spaces in the surrounding counties. So, so those are all things I think that we can do to help out with the issue. Another thing on top of that I've been supportive of, and the council's been moving action on this along with the Fire and Police Commission, is finally presenting an opportunity for the police to be able to tow vehicles that are driving recklessly. My idea is this: look, if folks out here think it's a game, then take their toys away so they can't play the game. It's the same thing. Look, I got 3 kids, an 11-year-old and 2 4-year-olds, right? If they're misbehaving, right, they got their little iPad that they like to be on. Well, the iPad's coming with dad for a little bit, right? So take the toys away if they refuse to abide by traffic law to protect not just themselves, but the greater public safety as well. And so I think members of the GMC can also help to combat crime here, especially in the central business district, by getting people back into the offices. And I used to tell constituents this as alderman all the time, because we had this issue in my district on the northwest side. People would come off of the state highways like a Capitol Drive. They duck their cars into these quiet, safe neighborhoods, places where they felt safe. And then they would conduct mobile drug transactions. But they're less likely to do that when we activate our public spaces. So I would tell folks, actually go outside, sit on your porch, walk your dog, do some gardening outside, take a walk around the block, because the folks that are doing it, they're superstitious and they're cowardly. So if you take the opportunity to engage in your public space, it encourages those folks to move away or to not do it at all. You're taking the space and opportunity away from folks to do that. And that's another thing that can help down here too. If there's more people downtown, if there's more activation in the spaces down here, if our offices are filled, either full-time or even on more flexible schedules, then you see less likelihood that people will engage in those sort of activities down here. So bringing those employees back downtown will not only help to curb some of the violent activities that we see down here, or the carjackings and the like, but it'll make sure that we have a strong and vibrant downtown economy as well, which we need for the fulfillment of services in every part of the city. A strong downtown is good for every single neighborhood in Milwaukee. I realize that, and I want that to be known in this room here as well. Another issue that we have that we're working diligently on is a sales tax. I know that this group knows that full well. Obviously, the legislature is on recess right now and will not be back into session until next year, but this is something that cannot wait anymore, right? It's been a number of years where we've had conversations, there have been fits and starts, but we've never actually seen any action on. Now we actually need the legislature to do something. We are getting to the point next year where the pension problem that we have is going to come to a head, right? We've got all these concerns around public safety, and we can't afford in this community to pay for additional police officers because the police and the fire service were not subject to the same restrictions that other municipal employees were under Act 10. So, their costs have continued to rise, even though our revenue structure has been broken. It's remained practically the same. The shared revenue payment coming to local governments, not just in Milwaukee, but other governments across Wisconsin, has been flat, and our ability to raise additional revenue just has not been there. We rely so heavily on the property tax. And look, I'm a property owner in Milwaukee as well. I don't want to pay more in taxes either. But I need the additional revenue in order to make sure that we're able to take care of the services that our residents, our visitors, our commuters all both expect and deserve. So I'm going to need your help in the GMC and the business community generally to take that conversation to Madison, to have that conversation with them so we can pull the resources that we need at the local level back here so that we can provide those services that folks need. And then another thing I think is important as well is the conversation around jobs. And I know this is something that folks have talked about over the years, right? Jobs, jobs, jobs. But I'm talking about actual family supporting jobs. I'm talking about jobs that make at least $15 an hour. Just this weekend, I had the opportunity to go to the Milwaukee Athletic Club, $63 million investment, saving that architectural gem right in our city. And the folks who are working in the service industry there, they're making $15 an hour. The city of Milwaukee has been a leader here as well, paying our employees at least $15 an hour. There are a number of other entities that have done the same thing. Milwaukee Tool, when they came in here, certainly they'll have up to 2,000 jobs making $75,000 a year plus, and that is wonderful. But the folks who sweep the floor, the folks who are providing janitorial services, the folks who are providing security services at Milwaukee Tool will make at least $15 an hour. And why am I bringing this up? Is because during the course of the campaign, if you paid attention to my story in the neighborhoods that I grew up in, you know, I came from really rough parts of town and moved around a lot. And I would hear constantly, you know, these stories about how in Milwaukee, we had the highest quality of life for African-Americans in the United States when they had access to family supporting jobs, when they had access to well-paying jobs in heavy manufacturing before those jobs went to right to work states down south, or they went overseas for cheap labor. When folks have access to economic prosperity, that puts them in the best position to be able to own their own home. When they own their own home and they can keep a roof over their kid's head and put food on the table, and they have less financial stress and they can buy a pizza on a Saturday, you know, that puts those parents and those families in the best position to be stable. And if those families are stable, guess what? The reaction that kids have when they go out into the public, in the school or on the streets, it's different. I can see it in one generation, from the way that I was raised growing up in Milwaukee to my own kids. My daughters, who are now 4, we can take any direction home, but because that's the only home that they've ever known, even at 2 or 3 years old, if I drive by and they're ready to go home, they say, wait a minute, Dad, like home's over there. It's because of the stability that we have, right? So if we're able to do that and we get to a critical mass of stability in our neighborhoods, and our neighborhoods are no longer porous, and the people who live there transient, right? Then you start to develop relationships. The people who live across from you or on the side of you, they become your actual neighbors, right? You start to care about each other. And when you get to a critical mass of that happening, that's how you get to true public safety. That's how you get to true public safety. And that's what all of us want. But it starts with having an opportunity at family supporting work that can sustain families and neighborhoods across Milwaukee. So my belief, again, is that when you do that, you'll make individuals stable, you'll make their neighborhoods stable. When that happens, the neighborhoods will be healthy, and healthy neighborhoods then are safe neighborhoods. And a conglomeration of that makes a safe city. And that's what all of us want to see. So thank you all very much for having me. Looking forward to having a couple of questions. All right.
Initially, Mayor Johnson had suggested that he could take a couple questions, but during the course of his comments, and mainly because of the comments I made that went too long, we were told no questions because we got to get on to the rest of the program. So we will have you back. You are welcome here anytime, and we will have you back to have more engagement directly with our membership. And I think all of us can say that if there's anything that Mayor Johnson has been, it's been accessible to the public and accessible to organizations throughout. So we do have also, again, we started locally and now we're going to talk globally with the program that we have today. I'm going to introduce the program and the speakers. The situation between Russia and Ukraine, the mounting tension with China, it's created global impact in key areas of business and the economy that we feel globally, but also feel here locally. Today, we're going to hear from Professor Shale Horowitz from the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee about how times of conflict affect business and economic decisions in international and local markets. Professor Horowitz has been at UWM's Political Science Department for more than 20 years. His main research areas have been international and ethnic conflict and political explanations of economic policy. His current research focuses on Chinese politics and foreign policy, the role that leadership ideologies have in ethnic conflicts. Following his overview, we have a couple of panelists who are going to weigh in on their direct experiences with the current climate. Our panelists include Becky House, who's the Senior VP, Chief People and Legal Officer and Corporate Secretary for Rockwell Automation, and Austin Ramirez, who's the CEO of Husco. As I mentioned, we also we're going to have a representative, Mr. Payne from the FBI, but he was unable to join us, so we will do that at a different time. But with that, I'm going to introduce, to start with, Professor Shale Horowitz to just talk about kind of where we are, and then he'll bring up his panelists. Professor Horowitz.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much for coming and listening to this discussion of a very important issue, which is affecting the whole world and all over the United States more and more in the last few years. So I'm just going to more briefly talk about Russia. That was in the news. It's a very interesting example. It's what we're a little bit obsessed with right now. But the real elephant or gorilla is China. Okay, so it's much bigger. It's much more important to the international economy. Has a much bigger impact. So the impact has been slower. It's not been this sudden crisis as with Russia, but this is the thing to really watch in terms of potentially very large impacts. So I'll just say a few words about Russia and then move on to China. Okay, so the Russian economy is relatively small compared to the Chinese economy. As we'll talk about later on, the Chinese economy is roughly the size of the United States. Most of you know that U.S. economy. Russia is more like Florida, the size of Florida or the size of a large Chinese province. Russia can be thought of as a kind of important gas station to the world economy. That's kind of a crude version of it. So what they're exporting is primarily raw materials. Everybody knows about oil and gas, but metals, other raw materials, processed raw materials, grain. The war caused a very abrupt cutoff of relations between Russia and the rest of the international economy. One of the interesting things here that we'll come back to later is initially that cutoff was imposed by state policies, right? Various kind of restrictions, especially financial restrictions on transactions with Russia. But what happened very quickly was that private companies started to respond in their own ways, and it turned out that these private restrictions, or what we're calling here private sanctions, turned out to have a very large impact also independently. So that's an interesting thing, something to watch. Okay, so the most important impact, as most of you know, has been on oil and gas supplies to Europe. Europe is very highly dependent on Russia. And so this has been an exception to the sanctions so far. Europe is still buying more or less the same levels of oil and gas that it was buying before the war started. And they have targets, supposedly, about phasing that out. But that could change very quickly if we get more significant atrocities and the footage of those things coming out of Ukraine. There's going to be much more pressure to move quickly. The European governments are trying to avoid that because they don't want to be tipped into recession by this, but it's possible. So that's an example of a bigger impact that could be coming. So the main impact here has been on international prices, of course, rising relative prices, especially of energy, and also of these other commodities or processed goods that are coming out of Russia. Again, the impact largest on Europe. Just some other things to mention briefly that are interesting to look at. State-imposed restrictions on financial assets held by the Russian state and Russian companies abroad. These were more far-reaching than we imagined that they would be, or most of us imagined that they would be before. It raises interesting questions about security of international financial transactions. governments and private companies and other entities hold financial balances in various places around the world. They assume they can use those. This example shows that you can't necessarily use them. They can be blocked, they can be restricted in various ways. It's something to keep your eye on. Debt defaults, both by the Russian government and Russian companies. These are not that significant relative to the scale of international debt markets related to other countries, but again, something to watch. The status of foreign assets owned in Russia. So a lot of Western multinationals have stopped operations in Russia. The Russian government is talking potentially about seizing those assets or temporarily seizing those assets. Again, there aren't large assets in Russia compared to a place like China, but that's another thing to keep your eye on. So let's move on now and talk more about China, which is potentially what we see in Russia, but on a much larger scale. And the kinds of disruptions we're talking about with Russia are already occurring more slowly in China. Okay, so the phrase that everybody uses here is decoupling. Okay, so in a kind of a crude way, you can think about it is that, China in the last 30 years became the world's factory. That's the expression that's often used. So especially the world's dominant manufacturer of labor-intensive or other low-cost products, and supply chains all over the world became dependent on China for supply. And alongside this, of course, you have the huge and growing Chinese economy itself, which, as I mentioned, is similar in size already to the US economy. Now, we've had a series of shocks which have destabilized this situation. So everybody knows about COVID. Everybody knows about supply chain disruptions related to COVID, related to the trade war between the US and China, which is on hold, but of course not over. And also we have the potential for disruptions of the kind that just occurred with Russia and Ukraine, but occurring with China. So this decoupling process has already started. When I talk to people or read about it, it seems like it's already gone further than most of us realize, or at least than I realized before. And the question is, how far does this go? What is the right way to conduct the process in a way that will protect the interests of the United States, of course, and of our regions and businesses? So what I want to do is I want to talk about just a few major forces which are driving this decoupling process, are likely to continue to drive this decoupling process, and what kinds of costs, problems, trade-offs do they create for the US economy, for the government to deal with, and also for businesses that are operating in China, whether using it as a manufacturing base or selling there on a large scale, or both. Okay, so the first type of disruption that I'm going to talk about related to China has to do with the nature of the Chinese economy and the types of policies that the Russian government pursues. So most people have learned to think of China, as having made the transition to a market economy, which is true. But it's a very different kind of market economy from the kind that we're familiar with. You can think of it as a kind of state-dominated market economy. What does that mean? Well, first of all, the state, it directly owns large numbers of key enterprises, both by industry and in various segments of the economy that the state considers to be important. But in addition to that, there's a much more direct control and oversight over all large-scale business activity, both by the central government in China as well as by the provincial and local governments. And they're doing this in a couple of ways. One of the ways is there's regulatory oversight in a variety of ways. You have to consult with the bosses, whether those are local bosses or central government bosses, depending upon the nature of your business. There's a party organization within your business. And then also your sources of financing are controlled by the state. Okay, so the state is your partner. You could even say that even if you nominally have private ownership, the state is your owner, your majority owner in an informal sense for all large-scale business. So this is obviously very different from the sort of thing that we're familiar with. What are they doing? Apart from control, they're also promoting their businesses, the large businesses that they have close relations with, in order to advance their position both within the Chinese market and abroad. Now, so far, this has primarily been occurring in labor-intensive or other low-cost markets. These are the markets where China has assumed a dominant role over the last 2-3 decades. It hasn't affected the United States economy as much because we already are not specialized in those businesses even prior to the Chinese entry into them on a large scale. So far, these Chinese policies designed to promote their businesses are affecting primarily other low-cost producers in the world. But now it's going to be affecting us because the Chinese economy is developing, it's moving up the supply chain into more capital and knowledge-intensive products. And this is something that the current President Xi Jinping, the current supreme leader, is making an extra priority, and he's going to put regulatory resources and financial resources into it. And what that means is that the goal of the Chinese government in their economy in these high-tech sectors is that they want to absorb the capabilities to produce these products, including through technological theft and preferences for Chinese products in the domestic market. They want to achieve domination first in the domestic market, and then they want to conquer foreign markets. And one thing I'll just mention about that, which is a key thing to keep in mind, is that their goal is not to assume a kind of equal position alongside other rich countries like the United States or regions like the EU or Japan in a kind of decentralized international economy at the high end. They want to dominate the high end. They want to produce the most important products, the most profitable products, and they want the other parts of the advanced international economy to be in a subordinate position in the supply chains that they control. So these are their goals. These kinds of goals have been affecting other countries in their dominant industries or their most important industries, and now it's coming for us, it's coming for our allies, and we all have to figure out how to adjust to this in some way. So this is a kind of a slow process, which is going to disrupt this easy relationship we had whereby they produce labor-intensive products at a low cost, and we import those and re-export them. Okay, another important source of disruption is political. Okay, so I think most of you are aware of this expression, surveillance state in China. This is something which is already far beyond anything that we're familiar with in the sphere of high technology. What it means in this case is that they want to use all levers at their disposal, including in all high technology industries, to maintain oversight over their citizens and what they consider to be internal security. So you can see some of these examples here listed: transportation, down to the level, not just trains, buses, and planes, but down to the level of bicycles and walking. Okay, all of it is being surveilled in various ways, and all of it is, the information about that is being centralized. Other things that you're familiar with: social media, financial services, telecommunications infrastructure, internet services, cloud services. The government wants to see directly what is going on in all of these industries. It doesn't just want to make sure that businesses operating in these areas aren't doing something the government wants. It wants to leverage these businesses to see what is going on in everyone's life and use it in any way which is useful to the state. Now, the problem is that once a business like this is safe for the Chinese government, it's not safe for us. Okay, so in other words, for example, if the Chinese government is authorizing certain companies to conduct searches in China, that means the searches all have to be consistent with the ideological objectives of the Chinese state. If search goes into a different country and is conducted by that same Chinese company, it means that company has the capability to have the same kind of control and oversight. And obviously that would not be acceptable in our own country, and it would not be acceptable in most other advanced countries. And the last area that I'll just talk about in sources of disruption is military security. This one you're all familiar with. Various kind of dual-use technologies which are important for military purposes. there is a risk of a military conflict or military crisis involving China, and we have to be concerned about preserving qualitative military superiority to deter a conflict, and we also have to be concerned with preserving a production base that can be used in a longer-term conflict. So with these forces pushing decoupling, I'll just mention a few dilemmas or problems that the government and businesses face, and then we will have our experts talk in more detail about what they see. Just to mention some of these points, we don't want to be dependent on China in areas that are too technologically sensitive, but we still want to maintain an international division of labor. What is too sensitive? Even things that are lower down on the value chain, you can be too dependent on those. Do we need to worry about sources of supply outside of China? In the rest of the world, how much of a Chinese presence in terms of Chinese businesses is acceptable in supply chains in those areas? Are sources of supply outside of China subject to Chinese pressure? And what do our local production capabilities have to be in these various other areas outside of Chinese control? Some similar dilemmas that businesses face. I've seen this expression lately, supply web instead of supply chain. You don't need a supply chain. You need something which is more redundant with multiple suppliers at each level. It's very difficult to know exactly how to execute and how to do. There's a big difference here between large and small companies, what they're capable of doing and how they're capable of adjusting to this problem. In the case of China, such an important market and you have to do business there, the pressure is getting harsher because the government is moving closer to wanting to replace the businesses that our companies are doing. How can they do business in that environment? How can they continue to make money and still plan for the worst? I'll stop there, and we will hear in more detail from our experts. Okay, so Becky and Austin, I'll start out with a really general question. Can you talk about the supply chain risks that you have seen over the last few years and how you and your peer companies are trying to adjust to those effectively? We'll go ahead and start with you, Becky.
Yeah, so I think increasingly over the last few years, from a supply chain standpoint, and whether you talk about challenges that we've seen through COVID or recent events with Russia and Ukraine, we were talking before this, and from my perspective, what we see is really what historically has been a real focus on kind of productivity, efficiency, lean supply chains, where's your most cost-effective footprinting, is through the series of events, things that no one ever thought would have been possible through risk management and evaluation, things like a global pandemic, shutting down transportation systems, increasing tariffs and changing geopolitical events that also address it, that have really led companies to take a broader look at resiliency. And so from a supply chain standpoint, it's really looking at every facet of it, right? Where is your manufacturing footprint? Where do you have capacity for it? And really a shifting mindset toward resiliency through everything from multiple sources of supply as opposed to sole source. When you think about logistics and transportation risks that you have, you look at localization, where are you getting things in and how can you have it? And so I think it's really under the broad umbrella of an increased focus on what are the costs and the risks associated with having a really lean supply chain, and have we appropriately gauged that in, as opposed to really having much more of a kind of a productivity or cost-sensitive bent.
Thank you, Austin.
Yeah, I can't add a lot to that. I would say that cost continues to be a huge driver. I mean, I operate in really globally competitive spaces, and absolutely we have to be resilient, but we can't do that by driving up costs. And whenever you talk about dual sources of supply or moving supply around, there is a cost implied in that. So we have to be really sensitive to both. And I think a supply web is the right way to kind of characterize what we're talking about. And it's the entire value chain, because we manufacture all over the world, we source all over the world, and it's about not ever being totally dependent on a single node as you think about that web, and being able to adapt as different challenges come your way. You can never forecast where the next challenge is going to be. You look back 2 years ago, we were in a COVID shutdown and nobody could get face masks. And a lot of people in this room worked on helping to provide emergency ways to figure out how to get face masks to folks. And so the knee-jerk reaction is, well, shoot, we gotta localize our supply chain for face masks. Well, I guarantee you the next emergency won't be face masks.
Thinking more broadly.
So it can't just be this knee-jerk about localizing everything and disengaging from the global economy. It's got to be about thinking more broadly about resilience, but still in the context of being globally cost competitive.
Just as a follow-up, both of you can comment on this. How do you do that, right? I mean, you're just talking about a trade-off, but in an individual company, how do you look for the areas where you do need more redundancy and resilience, and how do you find the areas where you can still rely more on single suppliers? How do you deal with that problem?
Yeah,
in detail. Go ahead.
There's not a simple answer to that, but you have to prioritize, right? You have to think about your supply chain and where are the categories where you're most at risk, whether it's a proprietary design or a certain material that you can only source in a certain place, or supply chains that just don't exist. One example for us is we purchase a lot of gray iron castings, and that's an industry that has totally left the United States. And so when we think about resiliency in that category, it's not about do we have a domestic source and an international source. It's about how do we think about developing a portfolio of international suppliers in that category space that lets us pivot as currencies change, as geopolitical events happen, and you kind of got to start at your highest risk category and work your way down, and it's a process that never stops.
I think that's exactly right. It's got to be pretty systemic, and especially when you look across most companies, and Rockwell's one of them, we have a fairly complex product offering. Right, and it's everywhere from push buttons to to programmable logic controllers that have electronic subcomponents and a hefty dose of semiconductors in them, right? So when we've got a fairly robust, and one of the good things coming out of COVID is we really put our enterprise risk management and our crisis management programs and processes through the ringer. Right, and having the right framework with the right cross-functional teams who are continuously reviewing, updating what are the biggest risks that you have, and our supply chain teams that are really working systemically across our product offerings. Where are your biggest revenues? Where are your biggest risks? Where are you seeing the constraints? But it gets down to your subcomponent and your component levels. Where are you seeing those challenges? Where do you see constraints on demand? It's engaging with the government, talking to the Commerce Department about where we see real issues with semiconductor, and getting at issues around how are we incentivizing investments with our subcomponent suppliers, right, to make sure that you can build up that supply chain and people understand that there's a difference, especially in the world of manufacturing, right? One of the benefits on the manufacturing flow is continuity of technology. Right, Allen Bradley products stick around for a really long time, and most manufacturing floors in the U.S. have stuff that might be 20 or 30 years old, and they rely on nodes and semiconductors that aren't the latest and greatest, that need to be the smallest to fit into your next version of your smartphone. How do we make sure we're incentivizing investments to maintain those older technologies? So it really is kind of a systemic approach across your product offering, peeling it back to understand where the biggest risk areas are, where your opportunities are, and kind of continuously updating based on what's going on in the world around you. Right, 5 years ago, if anyone had told our supply chain organization that they needed to plan for a global pandemic where air travel was shut down, you couldn't get supply, people would have laughed at you. Right? Folks would have said, what are you talking about? That's not in the realm of possibility. I think the series of events that we have seen have highlighted the what-if planning and the pressure testing down to that level are really important.
Just to pick up on one comment you made, we don't have any facilities in Russia or the Ukraine. I don't have any suppliers in Russia or the Ukraine. But the Russian and Ukrainian markets for both raw materials, so think like pig iron, as well as energy, as was referenced earlier, impact the whole world, but impact Europe acutely. So even though I don't have anything that touches those regions, we're seeing huge commercial disruption, particularly in our components that we source from Italy and from Germany and from Spain. So you can't predict what's going to cause it. You also can't necessarily predict what the scope of the impact is going to be. So you really have to always be thinking at a pretty broad level.
Just a related question about that. Some of these problems are difficult to address at the company level. So what has been done in terms of industry associations and their relations with the government so far, and has that really been effective? Is it possible to make that more effective?
Can we be more effective in working with our governments? Yes, I think that's short. Like that's an easy one, low-hanging fruit. I think in terms of, we've got close ties and relationships, things like Business Roundtable, NAM, that focuses on manufacturing in the U.S. And I think that's where some of it comes from in terms of thought leadership, comparing notes, understanding where the biggest pain points are, and to help inform the policymakers who are looking to solve the problems, right? It's no different than what the Mayorelect was talking about here. How do you engage people who know and have the actual perspective to help inform where and how you're making decisions? As I said earlier, yes, great, let's drive investment in the semiconductor industry here in the U.S. That's great, whether it's for defense, whether it's for manufacturing in the U.S., we need it to support it. But let's make sure we're not just driving that investment toward the cutting edge technology and the smaller and smaller nodes. If you want to protect your U.S. manufacturing base, you need to really protect existing and legacy products as well. So it's helping to inform where are the pain points and problems, and to give the real life perspective of the folks who are seeing where those pain points are, and to try to engage policymakers as they're trying to come up with solutions.
That was a great answer, much nicer than I would have been. I mean, the public sector is really bad at dealing with things like supply chain emergencies, right? The government just isn't designed, and really shouldn't be designed, to work that fast. Markets are really good at adapting. So, I look at, for example, the Section 301 tariffs, which has been a huge impact on my business. So it was a 25% tariff that President Trump enacted to try to pressure China into changing some of their really bad business practices around IP theft and around state funding of private businesses. And it was in the context of decoupling. Now, decoupling makes sense conceptually when you talk about the high end of the value chain. So I would certainly agree that the U.S. military shouldn't be dependent on semiconductors that are sourced in China for our sensitive military systems. Like, it makes sense to decouple there. Nobody is really talking about decoupling the entire economy. And you referenced this in your presentation. But the sort of things that we tariffed in the Section 301 tariffs are like machined parts and cast parts and pretty simple things. It taxed more sophisticated things as well, but a lot of the impact was on the lower end of the value chain, where we actually want to be integrated with China, right? They provide value to us. There's geopolitical value of having our two countries economically integrated to prevent, a hot war, God forbid, from ever happening. So I think more often than not, when the government gets involved in these sorts of things, they tend to make it worse rather than better.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, so the next question is about your operations in places that are subject to these kinds of sudden disruptions, like Russia and China, whether those are, marketing presences or manufacturing presences. How have you dealt with that? Was your initial planning adequate? And how have you tried to deal with it since these more serious crises have come up?
Your initial planning is never adequate, right? I mean, you have contingency plans and you think about these things, but you can't ever predict what the next global emergency is going to be. And just as an example, right now, in China, in January of 2020, they were the first to get hit with COVID, and they were really aggressive and they clamped everything down. And because of that, they actually came out of COVID before everybody else and really propelled this global economic recovery. But right now, it's the opposite. Right now, our facility in China is shut down. We're outside of Shanghai. The city's on lockdown. People can't leave their homes. Businesses can't run. At this point in the COVID cycle, I'd argue that's not a very wise approach to take, but that's the CCP's policy, and that, we're trying to figure out, like literally right now, how do we adjust our supply chain and our manufacturing footprint so that we can keep our customers supplied when one of our largest factories is shut down by the government?
Yeah, I would echo, you don't know what's coming next, which is why kind of your contingency planning and your processes really matter. So, we have a global crisis management program and a team, and that's their job, right, is to make sure that as things evolve around the world, we activate that team. We did it when we saw what was going on in Ukraine and with Russia. It started with our Europe team, brought in our global team to really evaluate what's going on, what are the potential impacts, what are you doing from a compliance, a financial, a supply chain, a people policy standpoint across all issues. And so from my perspective, it really is those processes that are both your, what's your framework to make sure you can react quickly, and you do some scenario planning and you do some tabletop exercises, and you couple that with an effective risk management program, which again regularly looks at what are the big things that could fundamentally cause material disruption to our business, and again do some of that pre-work to say if this then that, and then how does that inform your normal operations. And it was putting those things into effect, and similarly, we don't have manufacturing in either Russia or Ukraine. We've got employees in Russia, and we have a substantial presence in Poland with a fair number of Ukrainian folks who work in our facilities in Poland. And so our operations in Europe have had a huge impact when you look at the humanitarian crisis and where the issues are. So it's pulling the right people together around the table to figure out, all right, what are the key issues? How do we get after them? And making sure you've got the right people with the right perspectives who can make decisions and move quickly.
Okay, the next question is about cybersecurity. What are the most significant cybersecurity challenges you see right now? And also, is cybersecurity in China, is that an oxymoron? Does it exist? How do you deal with that?
So I'll speak to our program more broadly, right? I think the biggest challenge, and everyone knows this with cybersecurity, is right. They keep getting smarter, and there's new and there are different ways. So my perspective is it's always evolving, and the bad guys are getting smarter. And the other issue is ultimately this is always going to be a challenge because each and every one of us is a threat vector, right? And so we have a pretty material insider risk policy because all you are is one malware click away. Right? It's an employee clicking on something. It's someone who gets something in their feed. And so the combination of folks who are looking at different ways to attack, leveraging it from a business standpoint, right? Just it's a way to operationalize and make money now in terms of what they're doing, in addition to state-sponsored espionage and using cybersecurity as a tool that way, but it's the fact that you've got people who are involved in a massive way. So we partner very closely with especially federal agencies, whether it's the FBI or CISA under Homeland Security, to stay abreast of the biggest issues. They often reach out to us to say, hey, are you seeing this? And we reach out to them. And it's continuing to evolve your program and your practices, but with a keen eye toward insider risk policies and insider education, because it's your people who, we're all connected. And there's huge value in being connected and being able to get in touch with everyone and having networks. But the big downside of that is once they're in the door, they're in the door. So it's kind of staying vigilant. It's the black hole of investments. You could never spend enough money to be protected, but it's making the smart decisions and kind of staying on top of the newest technologies.
I don't have anything to add. I think that's right on. I would echo it's the black hole of investment.
So we can ask our CISO every time. We're like, it's an impossible question. So if you had X dollars, could you guarantee? And the answer is no. You never can. So it's just the risk mitigation and making those smart decisions.
And I would say we think about resiliency in our IT networks much the same as we think about resilience in our supply chain. So we're never going to be able to keep the bad guys completely out. So if they get in, how do we recover and recover quickly?
I can say it's a black hole from the productivity end to having been through too many trainings in my own institution. Okay, so last question. Here's a quotation.
Just by the way, It's amazing. No matter how many trainings you put people through, people still click on the dumbest stuff.
It looks cool, right? Bang.
And inevitably, there's the, wearing my HR hat, that's always the discussion across HR professionals is so at what point, because we do the phishing exercises, right? You do the tests, you send things out to people, especially around the holidays. Oh, you have a package waiting or you have whatever. And so how many times after somebody clicks on the thing when they shouldn't, do you say, it's time for you to look for employment elsewhere, right? Because of the risk that people present. And it is a tough issue, and how do you keep it front and center in people's minds?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be responsible for that. Okay, so the last question here. Here's a quotation from your boss. Rockwell joins the U.S. government and the global community in condemning Russia's attack on Ukraine and its citizens. So this is the whole private sanctions question. I mean, how do you deal with this question, both in terms of ethics and the public image of the company? What is your process for responding to these problems?
Yeah, I mean, as we've all seen, and it's interesting, I think it's Edelman's trust survey, right? You see the increasing importance and the trust that people put in the companies or the places that they work. And it's been corresponding with a decrease in trust in things like the government and the media. And I think, more and more what we see is people want to know what are the values and what's important to the companies and the places that they work. And does it align with things that are important to me? These are really, really hard issues. Ultimately for us, when we face them, and when we looked at this one in particular, we start with how do we keep our people safe? How are people safe and secure? What's the potential impact on our employees? Look at more broadly about what's going on in the community, and then how can we operate within the law and consistent with regulations. And ultimately for us, it was consistent with our values and our cultures. The sanctions that were ever increasing there, we're shutting down a substantial portion of our business and creating complexities with it. But ultimately, seeing the humanitarian crisis, the impact that it had, and being a U.S.-based manufacturer, this was something that we thought was important for us to take a position on and do it globally, and then support our people, both between charitable donations over there to help folks, as well as to facilitate our own people to volunteer and to donate as well to help folks in need.
Really not as relevant for us. We're a private company, so the complications are less. I would, and Russia's, it's not a good example, one, because we don't operate there, and two, because there's, the government has stepped in, there's sanctions. China's a lot more complicated, right? You look at what's happening to the Uyghur minority in China, and you can make a moral case that American businesses shouldn't be doing business in China, right? I mean, I look at that, and my calculus is a bit different, and I think it's our responsibility that every part of the global supply chain that we touch is, ethical and that I can be proud of. So, these decisions are getting a little bit more complicated over time, but, to some extent, you don't want businesses to be the arbiters of these things, right? Businesses' job is to go out and be successful in the marketplace. And if things get so bad that we really shouldn't be engaging with certain countries or certain regions, and that is a place where the government needs to step in and set those rules.
Also in a place like China, just to reinforce that point, if you step out, you paint a target on yourself. So you expect individual companies to do that. The business associations and the government have to provide them with some kind of cover and guidance. Okay, and that's it. I think we're ready to open it up to questions. Anybody? Yes, sir.
So we supply big OEMs. I supply the automotive OEMs, so think Ford and Chrysler and GM, and then people like John Deere and Caterpillar and C&H. And the challenge in supply chains, you just can't ever be last. So the pressure is still high in terms of supply shortages and logistics shortages and everything else, but we're never last. So that's constantly our job is to keep our customers' lines running and to minimize the kind of internal inefficiency and cost that gets generated.
Yeah, so as a publicly traded company, what I'll tell you about is what we talked to the market about in January as to where we were at and what we were seeing. We've got our earnings release coming up here in the next few weeks. But what I would say is it continues to be a dynamic situation, right? I mean, as a supporter of manufacturing globally, right, that's where our products flow to and where they go. We were seeing really sharp recovery, high demand for our products, and that was continuing unabated, but continuing to see supply chain disruptions that was leading to a heightened backlog. And a lot of that was tied to electronic components. So the underlying, subcomponents that we had, and in particular with respect to semiconductors. And so, in that January timeframe, that's kind of what we were seeing. And, when you first said, how are you doing? I was just gonna say, I'm kind of tired. But I know that wasn't a personal question. I think we all have been as we've been dealing through these times.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So Cecilia asked about some of the charitable efforts that we've done in Ukraine, and I'm not going to have the individual charities top of mind, but really partnering with those that have been globally vetted and where we're at. So individualized donations that we have made as a company of about $550,000 now that Rockwell has donated directly to those. But even more importantly, we activated our employee base over there. And so we're doing 2-for-1 matches for any of our employees who are donating to those organizations. And my team had rolled out last year a new volunteer platform for our employees that we were activating that had a combination of matching dollars for donations as well as dollars for doers. So for volunteer time, people could bank that and then we would contribute dollars for them. And we activated that in Poland for our employee base that was over there to really support, so they both could be taking, we also provide paid time off for volunteer efforts, so 24 hours of paid time off to help facilitate and to support it. So, I mean, both our own dollars and the company dollars to help support, but even more importantly, to help activate our people who are doing such amazing work. And we saw a huge uptick with that, with both our employees globally taking advantage of donations for Ukraine, but in particular our folks in Poland and other places in Europe who really are living with it right now.
Just to pick up on that, we don't operate at the same scale, and we did all the matching things too, but the coolest thing I saw at Husco is we've got a facility in the UK, and one of our employees' partners' parents lived in Poland and was, assisting refugees, and so our team organized, thousands of pounds of soap and toilet paper and supplies that they just organically organized and sent to support that family that was assisting refugees. And that's when you're most proud, is when you build that culture in the organization of the people really taking accountability for doing those sorts of things.
All right, thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Horowitz, and our guests, both from Rockwell and Husco. It truly is a conversation like this that takes us from the streets of Milwaukee to China and Ukraine and Europe, but all brings it back here to the impact that all this has on our daily lives. I can't help but think when it comes to Ukraine, and we had lots of stuff, but Ukraine is a country of about 44 million people. And I think by last count, at least 10 million people have been disrupted. They no longer have a place to live. Either they're gone to a different country or they're displaced within their country. And to think that 7 weeks ago, they would have been engaged in conversations like this, maybe talking about, what's going on in the U.S., where now some of them have taken up arms or they've had to go elsewhere. And it truly is a reminder of how connected we are as a globe, but also just the level of human suffering that has been felt over the course of the last few months, and the responsibility that all of us have just as global citizens. So I truly appreciate the conversation we had today, appreciate what the mayor had to say, and in some ways the charge that we are all given to have and take responsibility for that. It's something that, as an organization, and as somebody who works with colleagues who are here and is a colleague of you, I take personally and I take responsibility for. And as we continue to move along and move forward, I look forward to the work together. Next month, we will have Jim Skogsberg from Advocate Aurora here to talk about its 4 years since the merger. What impact has that had on our community here? What are the impacts in the industry, the very complicated and complex industry that Advocate Aurora works in, and we'll have opportunity for engagement on then. I also just want to express appreciation for the continued work that happens at the committee level. As we think about where we're going in the Greater Milwaukee Committee, energizing and making sure that the committee structure is valuable and valid is something that we will continue to be focused on, and many of you are working on or are part of those efforts. So I just want to express that appreciation. I trust and expect that the next time we're back, Greg will be back to chair the meeting and to be part of this, but I really appreciate everybody who has been here personally today and everybody who checked in online as well. And with that, I believe we're adjourned. Thank you.